The brass tag burned against Constance Avery's throat like a brand in the merciless Dakota sun. 19 years old with auburn hair, matted from weeks on the trail, she stood in the makeshift auction pen, formed by circled wagons on the scorched prairie outside Cinder Bluff. The metal bore the number 17, marking her as property to settle her wagon master's gambling debts. "Look at those hands," wheezed Reginald Pike, mine foreman, known as Barbed Wire Bill, for the way he trapped workers in endless debt. His thick fingers lifted her chin like he was examining a horse's teeth. "Clean. No calluses. She'll do fine serving in the company house." Constance's stomach churned. 3 days ago, Silas Boone had shackled her wrists and explained with tobacco-stained teeth that her parents' wagon fee remained unpaid after their deaths from trail fever. The debt would transfer to her new owner, along with 7 years of labor to work it off. Bids at $40. Boone called out to the handful of men gathered in the wavering heat. "Do I hear 50 from the tall buffalo grass 50 yards away?" Akacheta watched through war paint streaked across his cheekbones. The Lakota warrior had tracked this caravan for 2 weeks, following the mine's poison runoff that killed fish in the sacred streams where his people had hunted for generations. At 30, he bore a bullet scar under his ribs from the Battle of Slim Buttes 3 years past, and his Spencer carbine lay wrapped in oiled hide beside him. The eagle feathers in his braided hair, tied with a plain deerskin headband, stirred as prairie winds swept across the endless grassland. His band waited in the creek bed beyond the next rise. But Akacheta had come alone to witness this latest corruption. The white man's greed knew no boundaries. 55. Pike raised his hand, his other holding a leather quirt. "I'll test her spirit first." The whip cracked inches from Constance's face. She flinched, chains rattling, but kept her chin up. Something fierce burned in her green eyes, despite the terror. That defiance decided it. Akacheta rose from the grass in 2 fluid strides, bone-handled knife singing from its sheath. The chain parted with a metallic snap. Constance stumbled backward into his solid chest as he caught her shoulders. "You are not cattle," he said firmly, loud enough for all to hear. "Stay behind me." Her hands instinctively clutched his buckskin shirt pulse, thundering against his back. This painted warrior had materialized like an avenging spirit, but she'd heard the stories about what Indians did to captive white women. Still, when their eyes met briefly over her shoulder, she saw something unexpected in his dark depths. Protection, not predation. "Savage," Pike snarled, drawing his Colt revolver. "She's under legal contract." Akacheta's knife caught sunlight as he shifted to shield Constance completely. "Your law does not run here, Wasiku." The Lakota word for greedy white man dripped with contempt. Sheriff Claude Merrick spurred his horse forward, hand on his gun, but moving with strange reluctance. His weathered face showed internal conflict as he spoke. "Return the girl, Indian. She's property until Boone's debt is satisfied." The hesitation in his voice was barely perceptible, but Akacheta's trained ear caught it. This lawman was not fully committed to Pike's cause. "I am no one's property." Constance surprised herself by speaking her voice, carrying across the tense circle. 3 mine workers rushed forward with pickaxe handles. Akacheta moved like controlled lightning, twisted the first man's wrist until bones cracked, slammed his knife hilt into the second's forehead, then swung the broken chain like a whip to drop the third. All within heartbeats. Merrick's warning shot split the air, but the bullet went deliberately wide. The sheriff's aim was too good for such a miss to be accidental. "Stand down," Merrick called, but his voice lacked conviction. Akacheta was already backing toward the grass, his hand finding Constance's wrist with firm gentleness. A small black powder, a tin of damp black powder packed with green brush that belched thick smoke, hit the ground, stolen from army supplies during his warband's recent raids. Gray smoke billowed up in the Dakota breeze. "Run!" he commanded. They plunged into the buffalo grass as shouts erupted behind them. A rifle bullet whined overhead, another kicked dirt near Constance's feet. She'd never run so hard in her life, her lungs burning as the tall grass whipped at their legs. A third shot found its mark. Akacheta grunted and stumbled, fresh blood soaking through his shirt where his old scar had reopened. But he kept moving, one hand pressed to his ribs. "You're hit." Constance gasped. "Keep low." His voice stayed steady despite the pain. When they'd put half a mile between themselves and pursuit, she tore a strip from her dress hem and pressed it to his wound without being asked. He covered her hand with his to hold the cloth steady, their fingers interlocking briefly. Blood warm and red proved he was human after all, not some vengeful spirit from the plains. The endless grassland stretched before them under a sky so wide it made her dizzy. Behind them, lantern lights bobbed like fireflies as the search began. Her old life had ended in that wagon circle. Whatever came next, she was bound to this scarred warrior who'd cut her chains. "What's your name?" she asked as they caught their breath. "Akacheta. It means warrior in my tongue." He studied her face in the fading light. "The Wasiku scouts call me Stoneheart." "I'm Constance Avery." She hesitated. "Why did you help me?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. "The mine poisons our water. The auction steals on our hunting grounds. Both must end." But there was something else in his expression, a shadow of old pain that he didn't voice. Constance sensed there were deeper reasons for his intervention, secrets that would have to wait for trust to develop between them. The moon rose full and silver over the Dakota territory, casting long shadows across the prairie. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes began their evening song, wild and free under the vast canopy of stars. For the first time since her parents died, Constance felt a spark of hope. Night fell like a black curtain across the prairie, broken only by the howl of wind through grass and the distant yipping of coyotes. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, flickering with heat lightning. Behind them, lantern lights moved like hunting fireflies as Pike's men spread out in search patterns. Akacheta led them northeast toward Willow Gap, where Ash River braided through shallow channels. The old scar under his ribs burned with each step, but he set a steady pace through the trackless grassland. Constance matched his stride without complaint, though he could hear her labored breathing. "Tell me about this place," she said quietly as they walked. "Your people." "The Lakota have hunted these lands since before memory," he replied, scanning the darkness ahead. "The buffalo came here to calve the elk to winter. The streams ran clear and cold." His voice hardened. "Then the white man found copper under Iron Ridge. The poison began flowing downstream 3 summers ago." She was quiet for a moment. "My family came west seeking farmland. We never meant harm to anyone. Your family perhaps not, but men like Pike see only what they can take." He paused at the crest of a low hill, listening. "The mine workers are mostly good men trapped by debt. Pike pays them in scrip paper money worthless anywhere but his company store. They owe more each month than they earn." Like what would have happened to me, Constance realized. Exactly. 7 years would become 20. 20 would become forever. They descended toward the river bottom, where cottonwoods and willows grew thick along the water. The sound of flowing current masked their footsteps, but also hid any pursuit. Lightning flashed overhead, followed by the rumble of distant thunder. "Storm coming," Akacheta observed. "Good. Rain will wash away our trail." At the river's edge, he waded into the knee-deep current. The water was cold, fed by mountain snowmelt, even in late summer. Constance gasped as it soaked through her dress, but followed without hesitation. When the current tugged at her unsteady feet, Akacheta's arm circled her waist to keep her upright. "Stay close," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. They moved downstream through the braided channels, water swirling around their legs. The riverbed was slick with smooth stones that threatened to send them tumbling. More than once, Constance felt herself slipping, only to be steadied by Akacheta's firm grip. A thorn-covered branch, invisible in the darkness, gashed her ankle as they pushed through a willow thicket. She bit back a cry of pain, but Akacheta heard her sharp intake of breath. Without a word, he lifted her over the worst of the obstacles, his hands sure at her waist. Behind them, lantern light flickered through the trees. Voices called back and forth as the searchers reached the river. "Under here," Akacheta whispered, guiding her beneath a massive driftwood log that had lodged against the bank. The space underneath was cramped and dark, barely large enough for both of them. They huddled together in the shadows, hearts pounding from exertion and fear. Constance could feel Akacheta's chest rising and falling against her back, could smell the wood smoke and leather scent of his skin. Their breathing gradually synchronized as they fought to stay silent. "Found tracks by the water?" a voice called out, uncomfortably close. Lantern beams swept back and forth above their hiding place. Constance trembled partly from cold, but mostly from terror. If they were found. Akacheta's hand covered hers in the darkness, steadying her. His forehead touched the back of her head, a gesture of comfort and reassurance that transcended words or cultures. "You are brave," he whispered so quietly she barely heard it. They waited there for what felt like hours as the search moved on. Finally, the voices faded and the lantern lights disappeared. Only then did they crawl out from their refuge, soaked and muddy, but alive. Dawn was breaking over the eastern hills when they reached Amos Pike's homestead, a simple sod-walled cabin with a lean-to barn located in a shallow valley protected from the worst prairie winds. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a thin milk cow grazed in the yard. Amos himself emerged as they approached a weather-beaten man in his mid-40s with graying hair and calloused hands. His resemblance to Reginald was unmistakable, though, where the mine foreman was thick and brutal. Amos appeared worn down by hardship and honest labor. "Akacheta," he said with a nod of recognition. "Heard there was trouble in town yesterday." "This is Constance," Akacheta replied. "She needs sanctuary." Amos studied her torn dress and the raw marks on her wrists where the chains had bitten deep. His mouth set in a grim line. "My cousin's work, among others." "Then you're welcome here?" Amos gestured toward the cabin. "Both of you. There's a root cellar where you can hide if riders come." Inside the simple dwelling, Amos's wife Martha fussed over Constance's wounds while brewing willow bark tea for Akacheta's reopened scar. The cabin was clean, but sparse, a rough table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and sleeping furs arranged on a wooden platform. "Reginald and I were close as boys," Amos explained as they tended their injuries. "Grew up on neighboring farms back in Missouri. But he changed when the war came. Got a taste for giving orders, for having power over other folks. When he wrote asking me to come west and work his mine, I thought, He shrugged sadly. I thought it might be like the old days. Martha snorted from where she was grinding herbs. More fool you, Amos Pike. That man's been rotten since he was 12 years old. What changed your mind about him? Constance asked. Saw how he treated his workers. Saw the debts that never seemed to shrink no matter how hard men labored. Then I learned about the land schemes, the forged survey markers. Amos's voice grew bitter. He cheated me out of 40 acres with a fake claim paper, same as he's doing to others. I was a surveyor before I took up farming. I know the difference between weathered iron stakes and fresh ones. Akacheta leaned forward with interest. You have proof of this fraud. Some. Not enough to bring him down alone. Amos poured coffee from a battered pot, but maybe enough to help the right people. As the day progressed, they developed the outlines of a plan. Dr. Edwin Hart, the town physician, had been documenting injuries and illnesses among the mine workers' evidence of unsafe conditions and abuse. Nora Lister, the school teacher, had connections to territorial officials through her correspondence with other educators. If they could gather enough evidence. It won't be easy, Amos warned. Reginald has Sheriff Merrick under his thumb, along with half the town council. They'll call you outlaws and put bounties on your heads. But Constance had noticed something during their escape that the others had missed. The sheriff's aim was off when he fired at us, she said thoughtfully. A man doesn't miss that badly by accident. Akacheta nodded slowly. I thought the same. Perhaps Merrick is not as loyal to Pike as he appears. Loyal or not, he's still the law, Amos pointed out. And the law around here serves Pike's interests. That evening, as they prepared to leave Amos's sanctuary, Constance watched Akacheta clean and check his weapons with practiced efficiency. The Spencer carbine was a lever-action rifle from Army surplus, reliable, but requiring careful maintenance. His knife was beautiful, the bone handle carved with intricate designs, the steel blade honed to razor sharpness. But it was when he removed his braided hair, tied with a plain deerskin headband, that she noticed something that made her breath catch. Woven into the eagle feathers was a small braid of dark hair worn smooth by years of handling. The grief in his eyes when he touched it told her everything she needed to know without words. Will you teach me to shoot? She asked suddenly, as much to distract him from painful memories as to learn a useful skill. He looked up, studying her face. You have used guns before. Father taught me with his pocket revolver before he died. But that was taken when Boone put me in chains. Without a word, Akacheta handed her the Spencer. It was heavier than her father's small pistol, the woodstock worn smooth by use. He positioned himself behind her, his hands covering hers, as he showed her the proper grip and stance. The rifle kicks harder than a pistol. He explained, his voice low and patient. Keep your shoulder firm, squeeze the trigger slowly. His nearness was distracting the solid warmth of his chest against her back, and the wood smoke scent of his hair, the gentle strength of his hands guiding hers. When their fingers touched, as he adjusted her grip, both of them went very still for a moment. Like this, she managed to ask. Yes. His voice was rougher than usual. You learn quickly. They practiced until she could work the lever action smoothly and hit a target at 50 yards. As darkness fell, they shared a simple meal of rabbit stew and cornbread, sitting close together for warmth as night wind howled around the cabin walls. The hair in your braided hair tied with a plain deerskin headband, Constance said quietly as they prepared to sleep. Was it your sister's? Akacheta's hands stilled on the rifle he was cleaning. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Winona, he said finally. She was 15 when the traders came. They offered goods the tribe needed to survive the winter blankets, flour, coffee. The price was 3 young women. His voice grew distant. I was 17, too young to have a voice in council decisions, too weak to fight the men who chose her. Constance felt her heart break for the boy who'd watched his sister become property helpless to save her. I'm sorry. When I saw you in those chains today, I saw her face, saw my chance to do what I could not do then. He met her gaze. You are not my sister, but perhaps I can give you the freedom I could not give her. What happened to her? I searched for 2 years, found the trading post where she'd been sold, then lost the trail. She could be anywhere or nowhere. He carefully rewrapped the rifle. The braid is all I have left of her. They arranged their sleeping furs on opposite sides of the fire, maintaining proper distance. But as the night grew colder and the flames died to embers, Constance found herself shivering despite her blankets. Without discussion, they gradually moved closer, sharing warmth in the practical way of travelers and survivors. By dawn, she was sleeping with her back pressed against his chest, his arm draped protectively over her waist. When she woke to find them curled together, neither pulled away immediately. Instead, they lay still in the gray morning light, listening to each other breathe, feeling the steady rhythm of 2 hearts that had begun beating in harmony. Outside, a meadowlark sang its liquid song from a fence post. The day promised to be clear and bright, perfect for the dangerous work ahead. But for just a moment, wrapped in warmth and unexpected tenderness, Constance allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she wasn't running from chains, where this gentle warrior might teach her more than just shooting and survival. Then reality intruded as Amos called softly from outside the cabin. Riders coming up the valley. Best get to the root cellar. The respite was over. The hunt had begun in earnest. 3 hard days passed in a deadly game of cat and mouse across the Dakota prairie. Reginald Pike had posted rewards that drew bounty hunters like carrion birds, $50 for Constance Avery, $100 for the savage Akacheta. More troubling, Sheriff Merrick had deputized a dozen mine workers, giving them legal authority to hunt the fugitives across territorial lines. But something was wrong with the pursuit. Merrick seemed to be directing his men in circles, always arriving at promising locations just after the fugitives had moved on. When questioned by Pike, he claimed his quarry was unusually cunning, but his explanations grew more strained with each failure. The truth was darker than anyone suspected. Hidden in Merrick's desk drawer lay a photograph of a young girl with laughing eyes and dark braids, his daughter Emma, taken 6 months ago while visiting relatives in Yankton. Pike's message had been simple: find the fugitives, or Emma would join the other missing girls in the abandoned mine shafts. But watching Pike's cruelty increase daily, seeing the fear in the rescued women's faces, Merrick was beginning to understand that cooperation wouldn't save his daughter. Pike eliminated all loose ends, and Emma had seen too much during her captivity. Meanwhile, the pressure mounted from all directions. Pike's men vandalized Amos's vegetable garden and broke his water pump with sledgehammers, sending a clear message about harboring outlaws. They questioned every homesteader within 20 miles, searching barns and root cellars, offering coin for information. Dr. Edwin Hart rode out to treat Amos's burned hands, officially, from a cooking accident, actually from fighting flames when Pike's men tried to torch his hay barn. While tending the injuries, Hart carefully documented the raw chain marks on Constance's wrists and the bullet graze across Akacheta's ribs. Evidence of assault and unlawful imprisonment, he explained as he wrote in his medical ledger with precise penmanship. Territory law requires documentation of such injuries for potential court proceedings. He copied the relevant pages onto thin paper, hiding the originals inside his anatomy textbook. If we can get this to the right officials. Meanwhile, Nora Lister used her connections within the territorial school system to quietly spread word about conditions at Pike's mine. Her letters to colleagues painted a picture of systematic abuse that reached beyond county corruption. But their efforts seemed futile against Pike's growing influence. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Amos Pike, driven by guilt over his cousin's crimes and his own past betrayal, began investigating the mine's land claims using his surveying knowledge. What he discovered sent shockwaves through their small resistance movement. "Look at this," he said, spreading hand-drawn maps across his kitchen table. "The mine's expansion claim relies on survey markers I supposedly placed 3 years ago. Problem is, I was farming corn that summer, not surveying. Never set foot on Iron Ridge until last month." Akacheta studied the markings with a warrior's trained attention. "You are certain these markers are false?" "Dead certain. Real survey stakes from the 1870s show weathering from winter frost and summer heat. These have fresh hammer marks, barely 6 months old." Amos traced the boundary lines with his finger. "Reginald's been forging government documents to steal Indian territory for a railroad spur. If we can prove fraud, it would void his expansion claims." Constance finished. "Take away half his power." "More than half. The territorial government takes land fraud seriously, especially when it involves Indian treaty boundaries." Amos rolled up the maps. "But we need physical evidence. Someone has to get close enough to examine those stakes and document the forgery." That someone they all knew would have to be Akacheta. His knowledge of the terrain and ability to move unseen made him the logical choice. But the mission would take him deep into hostile territory, leaving Constance vulnerable to capture. "I go alone," he stated firmly. "No." Constance's voice was equally firm. "If you're caught, they'll kill you before any evidence can matter. You need someone who can get word to Dr. Hart and Nora if things go wrong. Too dangerous. Everything we're doing is dangerous." She met his dark gaze without flinching. "We're partners in this, Akacheta. I won't be left behind." The argument continued through the evening, but she wore him down with logic and determination. Finally, he agreed to take her as far as the ridge line, where she could serve as a lookout while he examined the survey markers. They left Amos's cabin before dawn, traveling on foot through broken country where horses would leave too many tracks. The terrain grew rough as they approached Iron Ridge rocky outcroppings and steep ravines that would challenge even experienced climbers. Constance's dress was entirely impractical for such work, so she'd borrowed men's clothing from Amos: canvas trousers, a cotton shirt, and sturdy boots. The transformation was remarkable. Dressed like a frontier woman in working clothes with her auburn hair braided back and her green eyes bright with determination, she looked capable of handling whatever the harsh country might throw at them. Akacheta found himself stealing glances at her throughout the morning, admiring not just her physical courage, but the inner strength that had emerged from her ordeal. They reached the base of Iron Ridge by midday, the copper mine's operations visible as an ugly scar across the mountainside. Smoke rose from the smelters, and the rhythmic pounding of stamp mills echoed off the canyon walls. A creek that should have run clear was stained orange-red with mining runoff. There, Akacheta pointed to a line of iron stakes marching up the ridge like fence posts. The boundary markers. They climbed through scrub oak and juniper, using game trails to avoid leaving obvious tracks. The altitude made breathing harder, and loose shale threatened to send them sliding into the ravines below. More than once, Akacheta had to grab Constance's hand to pull her up a particularly steep section, their fingers lingering together a heartbeat longer than necessity required. At the ridge crest, they could see for miles across the prairie they'd crossed. No dust clouds marked pursuit, but that meant little. Pike's men could be anywhere moving carefully to avoid detection. "Keep watch," Akacheta instructed, handing her a small mirror for signaling. Flash this twice if you see riders. 3 times if they're coming up the ridge. He descended toward the nearest survey stake, while Constance positioned herself behind a boulder with a clear view of the approaches. The marker appeared legitimate from a distance, an iron post driven deep into rocky ground with official territorial markings. But as Akacheta examined it closely, Amos's suspicions proved correct. The metal showed no weathering. The stamped numbers were crisp and sharp without the rounded edges that years of wind and rain would have caused. Most telling the post wasn't driven into undisturbed earth, but into a hole that had been recently dug and backfilled. Native grass around the base had been trampled and replanted. He was sketching the evidence in Nora's school primer when the mirror flashed twice from above. Riders approaching from the southeast. Akacheta tucked the book inside his shirt and began climbing back up the slope, using handholds in the rock face to move quickly. "How many?" he asked when he reached Constance. 6 mounted men moving fast. They'll be at the base of the ridge in 10 minutes. They had a choice: retreat down the back slope and risk being trapped in unfamiliar country, or make a stand among the rocks where they had defensive advantages but no escape route. Akacheta chose the middle ground. "We go down the north face," he decided. "Stay low, move quiet. If they follow, we'll have the high ground." The descent was treacherous, especially at speed. Loose rocks clattered away beneath their feet, and thorny scrub caught at their clothes. Constance slipped on wet stone and would have fallen 20 feet if Akacheta hadn't caught her wrist, his other hand finding solid purchase on a crack in the cliff face. For a moment they hung there, suspended above empty air, her weight threatening to pull them both down. Their eyes met, and she saw something beyond concern in his dark depths, something that made her breath catch despite their desperate situation. "I've got you," he said quietly. "I know," she whispered back. He pulled her up to safety, and they continued their careful descent. But the incident had cost them precious time. Behind them, voices echoed off the canyon walls as Pike's men began climbing the ridge. They reached the bottom just as the first shots rang out above. Rifle bullets sparked off rocks near their heads, the reports echoing like thunder between the canyon walls. Akacheta pushed Constance ahead of him into a narrow wash that offered some protection, his body shielding hers from the gunfire. "This way," he urged, leading her deeper into the maze of arroyos and rock formations at the ridge's base. They ran through the labyrinth for what felt like hours, the sound of pursuit never far behind. When they finally stopped to catch their breath in a hidden alcove, both were exhausted and bloodied from scrambling over sharp stone. "Did you get what we needed?" Constance asked between gasps. Akacheta patted the book inside his shirt. "Enough to prove fraud if we can get it to the right people." Then it was worth it. He looked at her sitting there in the shadows, clothes torn, face streaked with dust and sweat, but her chin still raised defiantly. Something shifted in his expression, a wall crumbling that he'd kept carefully in place since his sister's loss. "You could have fallen," he said roughly. "I could have lost you. But you didn't." She reached out to touch the concern lines around his eyes. "We're both here. We're both alive. Constance." Her name came out like a prayer. Before either of them could think better of it, his lips were on hers. The kiss was fierce and desperate, tasting of dust and danger, and something deeper than either was ready to acknowledge. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I should not have," he began. "Don't." She pressed her fingers to his lips. "Don't apologize for that." They stared at each other in the dimness, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Then reality intruded as shouts echoed from the canyon above. The hunters had found their trail, We should go, Akacheta said, though he made no move to pull away from her. Yes, she agreed, though her hand still rested on his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat. They separated reluctantly and prepared to continue their flight. But something fundamental had changed between them in that hidden alcove. What had begun as an alliance of necessity was becoming something far more dangerous and far more worth fighting for. The hunt was closing in from all directions now. Pike's rewards had attracted every desperate man within 100 miles, and territorial officials in Yankton were asking uncomfortable questions about the missing settler girl and the Indian uprising reported from Cinder Bluff. But their evidence gathering had borne fruit in unexpected ways. The territorial telegraph operator, a young man named Samuel Morrison, had taken notice of the increased message traffic between Cinder Bluff and the capital. The reply came only after a long night. Relay stations were slow and lines fickle in bad wind. When he learned that his own brother had died in Pike's mine the previous winter, officially from pneumonia, but Samuel suspected unsafe working conditions, he began quietly monitoring communications. What he discovered was damning. Pike was sending coded messages about cleaning up loose ends and permanent solutions to the Indian problem. More disturbing were the references to special cargo being moved to secure storage in the old workings. Samuel shared this intelligence with Dr. Hart during a seemingly routine medical visit, and the doctor passed it along through carefully arranged meetings. The net was tightening, but they weren't the only ones feeling the pressure. We have maybe 2 days before they make their final move, Hart warned during a clandestine gathering in his clinic after hours. Pike's talking about bringing in territorial militia. Once that happens, anyone helping you two becomes enemy combatants. Constance studied the faces around the small room, Hart with his graying whiskers and kind eyes, Nora with her schoolteacher's determination, Amos with his weather-beaten features marked by guilt and resolve. These people were risking everything for 2 strangers, asking nothing in return except the chance to do what was right. "You've done enough," she said quietly. "All of you. Akacheta and I can disappear into the Badlands, find sanctuary with his people, until this blows over." "No." Akacheta's voice was firm. "Running solves nothing. Pike will continue poisoning the waters, selling women like cattle, stealing land through fraud. Others will suffer what you suffered." "Then what do you propose?" Hart asked. Akacheta looked at each of them in turn, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "We force a confrontation. Bring everything into the open where it can't be hidden or denied." "That's suicide," Amos protested. "Pike has 30 armed men, the sheriff's backing, and territorial authority. We have, 5 people and a handful of documents." "Sometimes that's enough," Constance said unexpectedly. "Sometimes the truth is stronger than guns." She was thinking of stories her father had told about David facing Goliath, about small acts of courage that changed the course of history. But she was also thinking of the other girls trapped in Pike's operation, enduring what she had barely escaped. "There's something else," Hart said quietly. Samuel Morrison mentioned telegraph messages about missing women indentured servants who supposedly died in accidents. The reply came only after a long night. Relay stations were slow and lines fickle in bad wind. But there's no medical record of their deaths, no burial permits. I think Pike's been eliminating witnesses. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Murder was a capital crime, even on the frontier. If they could prove Pike had killed those women to cover his tracks, where would he hide the bodies? Constance asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Old mine shafts," Amos suggested grimly. "Plenty of them in the hills around Iron Ridge. Some go down hundreds of feet. Akacheta nodded slowly. Find the bodies, find the proof. But it means going back to the most dangerous place in the territory. I'll go with you, Constance said immediately. Absolutely not. You need someone who can identify the women. I saw them at the auction, heard their names, Esther Whitmore and Miriam Cross. Her jaw set stubbornly. Besides, you said we were partners. The argument that followed was intense, but brief. In the end, practical necessity won out over protective instincts. They would need all their combined skills to infiltrate Pike's stronghold and return with evidence. As they prepared to leave Hart's clinic, Constance caught Akacheta's arm. What aren't you telling me? He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the lamplight. My war band is camped 20 miles north of here. If this goes wrong, if we're captured or killed, they'll retaliate. Not just against Pike, but against the whole territory. How many warriors? 37. Young men who lost family in the relocations, who've been looking for reasons to fight back. His voice was heavy with responsibility. They follow me because they trust my judgment. If I fall here, then we don't fall. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the war paint streaks that had faded during their days of flight. We succeed or we die trying. But we don't abandon those girls. Something flickered in his dark eyes, surprise at her determination, but also a deeper emotion that made her pulse quicken. You have the heart of a warrior, Constance Avery. I learned from the best, she replied softly. They left Cinder Bluff before dawn, riding horses that Amos had acquired through discreet trades with neighboring farmers. The mounts weren't much an aging mare for Constance and a sturdy gelding for Akacheta, but they would serve for the hard journey ahead. The landscape they crossed was harsh and unforgiving, all red rock canyons and alkali flats where nothing grew except sagebrush and prickly pear cactus. Heat shimmers danced on the horizon, and the sun beat down mercilessly from a cloudless sky. They reached the outskirts of Pike's domain by evening, camping in a hidden arroyo where a trickle of water seep kept a few cottonwoods alive. As darkness fell, they could see the glow of the mine's operations in the distance, forge fires and lanterns marking the location of Pike's industrial empire, built on stolen land and human misery. Tomorrow, we end this, Akacheta said as they shared a cold supper of jerky and hardtack. Tomorrow we end this, Constance agreed. But as she settled into her blankets for what might be their last night together, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. In the distance, a night owl called its lonesome song to the indifferent stars. Somewhere in those mountains, evil men were planning further cruelties. And somewhere among the abandoned mine shafts, the bodies of murdered women waited for justice. Sleep came fitfully full of dreams about chains and darkness and the sound of crying that echoed from deep underground places where the sun never shone. The assault on Pike's stronghold began at dawn with a carefully orchestrated deception. Amos Pike, dressed in his best clothes and carrying a leather satchel full of surveying equipment, rode boldly up to the mine's main gate. The guards recognized him immediately. Reginald's disgraced cousin come to cause more trouble. I'm here to file a formal land dispute, he announced to the armed men blocking his path. Territorial law requires me to examine the boundary markers in question and present evidence to the county recorder. You ain't welcome here, Amos, growled the lead guard, a thick-necked brute named Carver. Boss's orders? Then the boss can explain to the territorial government why he's interfering with official surveying business. Amos held up an impressive-looking document with official seals. This here's a court order. You boys want to be charged with contempt. The commotion drew more men, including Sheriff Merrick himself. While they argued over jurisdiction and legal technicalities, Akacheta and Constance approached the mine from the rear, using abandoned shafts and equipment sheds for cover. The search for evidence proved more difficult than expected. The old workings honeycombed the mountainside like a maze, many of them partially collapsed or flooded with seepage. They checked shaft after shaft, finding nothing but rust and decay. It was Constance who noticed the smell. "There," she whispered, pointing to a timber-framed opening that looked newer than the others. "Something's wrong with that one." The odor was faint but unmistakable, the sweet, sick scent of decomposition. Akacheta tested the air current and nodded grimly. "Stay back. Let me check first." He descended the wooden ladder into darkness, returning minutes later with confirmation of their worst fears, and something else, a small leather-bound book clutched in his hand. 2 bodies. Young women badly decomposed. They've been there for months. He held up the book, but one of them kept a diary. Constance's hand flew to her mouth. Esther and Miriam. Can't tell for certain, but one was wearing a dress similar to what you described, blue calico with white buttons. And this... He opened the diary to a page marked with a pressed flower. "Listen to this. RP says we know too much about the letters he sends to the capital. Says someone named BC in the territorial office helps him with the Indian problems. Going to move us to the deep workings tomorrow. I'm scared." "BC?" Constance breathed. "Someone in the territorial government is helping Pike. More than helping. According to this, they've been planning to eliminate all the indentured women to cover their tracks." Akacheta's face was grim. "This goes higher than we thought. They had found their evidence, but at a terrible cost. Those girls had suffered and died alone in the darkness, murdered to protect not just Pike's schemes, but a wider conspiracy reaching into territorial government itself." "What now?" Constance asked. "Now we get those other girls out before they suffer the same fate." But their reconnaissance had taken too long. Amos's distraction was failing as territorial officials arrived to mediate the land dispute. Worse guards were beginning systematic searches of the mine's perimeter. They had perhaps an hour before discovery became inevitable. "We need those other girls," Constance said. "The ones still alive. If we can free them and get them to safety. Too dangerous. Pike's expecting trouble now. His men are armed and alert. Then we make it look like something else. Not a rescue, an accident." She outlined her plan quickly. It was bold to the point of recklessness, but it might work if they moved fast and luck favored them. Akacheta listened with growing admiration for her tactical thinking. "You're certain about this?" he asked when she finished. "Those girls are going to die down there just like Esther and Miriam. We're their only chance." He nodded slowly. "Then we do it your way." The mine's powder magazine was located in a reinforced stone building near the main shaft, heavily guarded, but predictably so. While Constance created a diversion by setting fire to a hay barn on the opposite side of the compound, Akacheta slipped past the guards and into the explosive storage. Black powder was dangerous stuff, unstable and unpredictable, but it was also the key to their plan. He carefully removed 3 small kegs, along with coils of fuse cord and blasting caps enough explosive to collapse a tunnel or blow out a mine shaft without bringing down the entire mountain. Meanwhile, Constance had located the workers' barracks, where the indentured women were housed. 2 guards watched the building, but they were more interested in the fire burning nearby than in their supposedly secure prisoners. She approached from the blind side, using equipment sheds for cover. The barracks door was barred from outside, a clear violation of territorial safety laws that would be additional evidence if they survived to present it. "Sarah, Mary, anyone inside?" She called softly through the narrow window. A young woman's face appeared pale and frightened. "Who's there?" "My name is Constance. I'm here to get you out. You can't be here if they catch you. They won't. But I need you to trust me." "How many girls are inside?" "4 of us. But the door's locked and barred." "Stand away from the north wall. There's going to be an explosion." The powder charge was small but precisely placed. When it detonated, it blew a man-sized hole in the barracks wall without triggering a general collapse. Smoke and dust billowed out as Constance helped the women climb through the gap. They were a pitiful sight, thin from inadequate food, bruised from rough treatment, wearing the same tattered dresses they'd been sold in months earlier. But their eyes blazed with desperate hope as they realized rescue had actually come. "This way," Constance urged, leading them toward the prearranged meeting point where Akacheta waited with the horses. But Pike's men were reacting faster than expected. Shouts rang out across the compound as guards converged on the damaged building. Rifle shots cracked in the distance, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. "Run!" Akacheta called as he saw them coming. "Don't stop for anything." The 5 women sprinted across open ground toward the arroyos and rock formations that offered concealment. Behind them, angry voices were organizing pursuit. Dogs began barking as handlers released tracking hounds into the fading daylight. They reached the horses just as the first pursuers crested the ridge. Akacheta's Spencer cracked twice, dropping 2 men and sending the others diving for cover. But there were too many of them, and more arriving every minute. "Take the girls and go," he told Constance as he reloaded. "I'll hold them off. We go together or not at all. This isn't the time for heroics." "Exactly my point." She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward his horse. "Mount up, warrior. We're leaving." The chase that followed was a nightmare of pounding hooves and whistling bullets. Pike's men pursued on fresh horses, while Akacheta's group rode tired mounts carrying double loads. Only the approaching darkness and Akacheta's knowledge of the terrain kept them ahead of capture. They followed game trails through broken country, where pursuit would be difficult, but the pace was punishing. One of the rescued women, weakened by months of poor treatment, began to slip from her shared saddle. Constance caught her just in time, holding her steady while their horse negotiated a steep descent. "What's your name?" she asked the girl. "Sarah. Sarah Fleming. I was sold 6 months ago to pay my stepfather's whiskey debts." "You're free now, Sarah. Hold on tight, we're going to make it." But disaster struck without warning. A rifle bullet fired from long range by one of Pike's best marksmen caught Sarah in the shoulder. She screamed and would have fallen if not for Constance's desperate grip. "She's hit," Constance cried out. Blood soaked through Sarah's dress as she slumped forward semi-conscious from pain and shock. Behind them, Pike himself had joined the chase, his face twisted with rage at seeing his property escape. "There." Akacheta pointed toward a narrow canyon that cut between 2 mesas. "We can lose them in the rocks, tend her wound." They plunged into the canyon just as the sun disappeared behind the western rim. In the growing twilight, the pursuit became a deadly game of hide-and-seek among the stone formations. Akacheta led them through passages so narrow, the horses' flanks scraped against the walls up switchback trails that would challenge mountain goats. But they couldn't outrun their pursuers forever. The canyon had only one exit, and Pike's men were smart enough to split their forces, some following directly, others riding to block the far end. "We're trapped," one of the rescued women whispered as they took shelter in a hidden alcove. "No," Constance said firmly, studying the canyon walls above them. "We're positioned." She'd been thinking about this possibility during their desperate flight, remembering stories her father had told about ancient fortresses, built in places that could be defended by small numbers against larger forces. The canyon's geology was perfect for what she had in mind. "You have a plan?" Akacheta asked as he tried to stop Sarah's bleeding with strips torn from his shirt. "I have the beginning of one, but it requires those explosives you took perfect timing and more luck than any reasonable person should count on." As she explained her idea, the others listened with growing amazement. It was audacious to the point of madness, requiring precise coordination and split-second timing. But it just might work if everything went perfectly. "And if it doesn't work?" Sarah asked weakly. "Then we die fighting instead of running," Constance replied. "I can live with that choice." They spent the remaining daylight preparing for the battle to come. Akacheta scouted the canyon's defenses, identifying key positions and weak points in the rock walls. Constance tended Sarah's wound while teaching the other women basic marksmanship with captured pistols. As night fell, Pike's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "I know you're in there. Come out peaceful and I might let some of you live." The response came from above, where Constance had positioned herself with Akacheta's Spencer rifle. "The only one coming out of this canyon will be Justice, Mr. Pike, along with the evidence of your murders." Pike's face went purple with rage. "You sanctimonious little witch, I'll see you hanged for theft and conspiracy. Will you then explain to these men why you murdered Esther Whitmore and Miriam Cross? Tell them about the diary we found with their bodies." A murmur ran through Pike's men. They'd been told they were chasing escaped indentured servants and a renegade Indian. Murder was a different matter entirely. "I don't know what you're talking about," Pike snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "Don't you? Then maybe you can explain the fresh survey markers on Iron Ridge, the ones with forged signatures authorizing theft of Indian treaty land, or the letters to BC in the territorial office about the Indian problem." More murmurs from the men. Land fraud was a federal crime, and association with it could bring down territorial justice on every man involved. The mention of government corruption made several of them exchange worried glances. "Enough talk." Pike raised his rifle. "Take them alive if you can, dead if you must." But before he could fire, another voice cut through the tension, Sheriff Merrick riding up from behind Pike's position with his own deputies. "Stand down, Pike." Merrick called out, his voice carrying new authority. "You're under arrest for murder, fraud, and conspiracy." Pike spun around his face, registering shock and betrayal. "You work for me, Merrick. Remember what I have of yours? Not anymore." Merrick's voice was steady, though Constance could see the pain in his weathered features. Emma would rather die free than live knowing her father chose cowardice over justice. The revelation hit Pike like a physical blow. His hold over the sheriff had been the threat to Merrick's captured daughter, but the lawman had finally chosen conscience over compliance. "You fool!" Pike screamed. "She's already dead. I had her killed yesterday when I heard federal marshals were coming." The lie was too much for Merrick to bear. His gun came up, but Pike was faster. The mine foreman's bullet took the sheriff in the chest, sending him tumbling from his horse. The battle erupted with volcanic fury. Constance's first shot took Pike in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping his rifle. Akacheta emerged from concealment among the rocks, his Spencer cracking steadily as he picked off Pike's men with deadly precision. But the rescued women weren't helpless observers. Armed with pistols from Pike's fallen guards, they added their own fire to the defense. Even wounded Sarah Fleming proved to be an excellent shot, a skill learned from years of hunting game on her family's farm. The canyon became a cauldron of smoke and flame as bullets ricocheted off stone walls. Pike's men found themselves caught in crossfire from multiple directions, unable to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to deadly accurate shooting. "Kill the Indian first," Pike screamed, clutching his wounded shoulder. He's the one holding them together. But Akacheta was everywhere and nowhere, moving through the rocks like a ghost. One moment he'd appear to drop a guard with a precise shot, and the next he'd vanish into shadow before return fire could find him. The tide turned when Pike, desperate and wounded, decided to end the standoff with one final gambit. He'd kept one keg of blasting powder from the explosives Akacheta had stolen, and now he lit the fuse with shaking hands. "If I can't have you, nobody can," he roared, hurling the keg toward the alcove where the women were sheltered. But Constance was ready. Her shot caught the keg in midair, detonating it harmlessly against the canyon wall. The explosion brought down a shower of rocks that blocked one of Pike's escape routes, but left the women unharmed. "My turn," Akacheta said quietly, emerging from cover with his rifle trained on Pike's chest. The final confrontation was brief but decisive. Pike, seeing death in the warrior's eyes, made one last desperate attempt to draw his hidden pistol. But Akacheta was faster, and his shot was true. As the gun smoke cleared and the echoes faded, an unexpected silence fell over the canyon. Pike lay motionless among the rocks, his reign of terror finally ended. Most of his surviving men had thrown down their weapons when they saw their leader fall. Sheriff Merrick, wounded but alive, was helped to his feet by his deputies. His first words were about his daughter, Emma. "Is she really—" Pike lied. Constance called down from her perch. "We found evidence that she's being held in a line shack 20 miles north of here. The diary mentioned her specifically." The relief on Merrick's face was profound. For months, he'd lived with a terrible choice between duty and family, watching corruption flourish because the price of resistance seemed too high. Now wounded but finally free, he could begin the work of redemption. Dr. Hart arrived within hours, having followed the sound of gunfire with a wagon full of medical supplies. As he tended the wounded and documented the evidence, the full scope of Pike's crimes became clear. The diary contained names, dates, and details of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. BC stands for Bradford Carruthers. Hart read from the blood-stained pages. Deputy Territorial Administrator. He's been taking bribes to approve fraudulent land claims and suppress investigations into missing persons. Not anymore, Merrick said grimly, pressing a bandage to his chest wound. Soon as I can ride, I'm heading to Yankton with warrants and evidence. This corruption ends here. As the immediate crisis passed, Constance found herself sitting on a boulder, hands shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. Akacheta sat beside her, checking her for injuries with gentle hands. "It's over," he said simply. "Is it?" She looked at the scattered bodies, the wounded men calling for help, the chaos of justice finally being served. What happens now? Now the law takes its course. Pike's dead, his conspirators will be arrested, and there's enough evidence to clean house from here to Yankton. And us? He was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the harsh morning light. Blood streaked her cheek from a graze she hadn't even noticed, and her borrowed men's clothes were torn and dusty. But her green eyes still blazed with the fierce determination that had first caught his attention in that auction circle. That depends on what you wanted, Constance Avery. She stood up, stepping close enough to see the concern in his dark gaze, close enough to smell the gunpowder and leather scent that had become familiar and precious. "I want what you promised me the first day," she said softly. "Freedom. Not just from chains, but from a world where women are property and people are cattle to be bought and sold. That world may take time to change. Then we help change it. Together. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of an old scar. You asked me once what I wanted. I want to stand beside you as an equal, not behind you as property. I want to build something better than what we're tearing down. Even if it means living between two worlds, white and Indian, civilized and wild. Especially then. Someone has to bridge those worlds, Akacheta. Someone has to prove that different people can choose to trust each other to build instead of just destroying. He caught her hand in his, holding it against his cheek for a moment before speaking. The territorial clerk in Yankton asked Sheriff Merrick yesterday if you were my wife. He told him you weren't property, not mine, not anyone's. But he didn't answer the real question. What's the real question? Whether you choose to be my partner. Not because you have to, not because circumstances force it, but because you want to. She smiled then, the first truly joyful expression he'd seen on her face since that first day in the auction circle. I choose partnership, Akacheta. I choose freedom. I choose you. And I choose you, Constance Avery. Free woman, brave soul partner in all things. Their kiss tasted of dust and victory of promises kept, and futures earned through blood and determination. Around them, the business of justice continued, officials examining evidence, doctors treating wounded, the rescued women giving their testimonies to court reporters. But for two people who'd found each other in the midst of darkness, the most important business was already complete. They'd chosen each other freely as equals with no chains to bind them except the ones they forged themselves from love and mutual respect. 3 months later, autumn painted the Dakota hills in shades of gold and crimson as the territorial courthouse in Deadwood became the center of the most significant corruption trial in the region's history. The evidence against Pike's surviving associates was overwhelming, but it was the diary found with the murdered women that brought down the wider conspiracy. Bradford Carruthers, deputy territorial administrator, was arrested in his Yankton office while attempting to destroy incriminating documents. His trial revealed a network of corruption that stretched from local mining claims to federal Indian policies. The scandal forced resignations throughout the territorial government and led to sweeping reforms in how land disputes were handled. Sheriff Merrick, his cooperation with the investigation having earned him recognition as a hero, was reinstated with full honors. His daughter Emma, rescued from the line shack exactly where the diary had indicated, testified eloquently about Pike's crimes. Samuel Morrison received a commendation for his role in exposing the corruption through telegraph intercepts. The reply came only after a long night. Relay stations were slow and lines fickle in bad wind. But perhaps the most significant change was in the relationship between white settlers and native tribes. The scandal had exposed how corruption and greed fueled conflicts that honest people on both sides wanted to avoid. New treaties were negotiated with transparency and federal oversight, establishing frameworks for peaceful coexistence that would endure for generations. On a crisp October morning, with frost sparkling on the prairie grass and the air sharp with the promise of winter, Akacheta and Constance stood before a territorial judge justice of the peace authorized to perform legal marriages. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, held at the site of their first kiss in the hidden alcove where they discovered their feelings for each other. The ceremonial war bonnet appears only for the rite. In action, he wears a simple headband and deerskin shirt. Witnesses included all their allies, from the struggle Amos with his hands healed and his farm rebuilt, Dr. Hart with his medical bag never far away, Nora with wildflowers picked from the schoolyard, Samuel Morrison with telegraph keys jingling in his pocket like bells. The reply came only after a long night. Relay stations were slow and lines fickle in bad wind. Sheriff Merrick attended with his daughter Emma, both bearing scars, but both free. Members of Akacheta's band attended in formal dress, their presence marking the historical significance of a union between worlds that had been at war. Several of the rescued women came as well, now building new lives with the help of territorial assistance programs established in the wake of the scandal. Do you, Akacheta, take Constance as your partner in marriage, promising to stand with her as an equal in all things? The administrator asked. I do, he replied in clear English, and repeated the vow in Lakota for his people to understand. Do you, Constance, take Akacheta as your partner in marriage, promising to stand with him as an equal in all things? I do, she answered, her voice carrying across the gathering like a bell. There were no rings. Such symbols had no meaning for people who'd learned that true bonds couldn't be forged from metal. Instead, they exchanged practical gifts that represented their partnership. He gave her a deed to land. They would farm together. She gave him a rifle to hunt game for their table. Equal contributors to a shared life built on choice rather than compulsion. As they kissed to seal their vows, autumn wind rustled through the grassland like approving applause. Above them, a red-tailed hawk circled lazily in the crystalline air, riding thermals toward whatever horizons called to its wild spirit. The wedding feast was held at Amos's rebuilt homestead, featuring traditional foods from both cultures, roasted venison and buffalo, alongside cornbread and apple preserves. Stories were shared in multiple languages, with translators helping everyone understand the heroic tale that had brought them all together. As evening approached and guests began departing for their various homes, Akacheta and Constance found themselves alone on the porch, watching the first stars emerge in the vast Dakota sky. Any regrets? He asked, his arm around her shoulders as she leaned against his chest. Only one, she replied thoughtfully. His body tensed slightly. What's that? I regret that it took chains and corruption and near death to bring us together. I regret all the suffering that had to happen before justice could prevail. She turned in his arms to face him. But I don't regret a single choice we made along the way. Not the risks, not the fights, not the decision to trust each other when trust seemed impossible. Even when I kidnapped you from that auction, especially then, you didn't kidnap me, Akacheta. You liberated me. There's a difference between taking someone's freedom and giving it back to them. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the prairie wind through grass, the distant call of owls, the soft lowing of cattle in nearby pastures. It was a peaceful sound, the sound of a land where people were building lives instead of just surviving them. What happens now? Constance asked eventually. Now we do what we've always done, Akacheta replied. We choose each day to trust each other, to work together, to build something better than what we inherited. We raise children who know that freedom is earned, not given. We help others who face the kinds of chains we broke. We prove that different worlds can become one world when people choose love over fear. She smiled, remembering the frightened girl who'd stood in chains in a dusty auction circle, wondering if she'd live to see another sunrise. That girl had become a woman who'd helped bring down a criminal empire and established new standards of justice for an entire territory. The transformation seemed impossible, but it had happened one choice at a time. I love you, Akacheta, she said simply. And I love you, Constance, he replied. My partner, my equal, my choice. Above them, the autumn stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, marking time and seasons, and the endless cycle of endings that became beginnings. Somewhere in the darkness, night birds called to their mates and were answered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a farm to establish a community, to build the ongoing work of healing a scarred land. But tonight was for gratitude for the miracle of two people who'd found each other across the divide of different worlds and chosen to build a bridge made of trust and love. As they rose to go inside their new home, Constance looked back once across the moonlit prairie. In the distance, barely visible, stood the spot where she'd first been sold like cattle. But that place held no power over her now. She'd broken those chains forever, not just for herself, but for others who would never have to endure what she'd endured. The brass tag that had once marked her as property lay buried somewhere in the grassland, rusted and forgotten. But the freedom it had tried to deny lived on in every breath she drew, in every choice she made. In every morning she woke up beside the man who'd taught her that true strength lay not in breaking others, but in refusing to be broken yourself. Hand in hand, they walked into their future together. Two people who'd proven that love freely chosen was stronger than any chain that justice delayed was not justice denied, and that sometimes the best way to change the world was simply to refuse to accept it as it was. In the Dakota Territory, as autumn deepened toward winter, the work of building a better tomorrow continued. And at its heart stood a partnership forged in struggle, tempered by hardship, and perfected by the simple, radical act of choosing each other freely as equals in a world that had tried to make them anything but.